please do keep submitting your questions. Now it's time to get a thought leader's feedback on the added value that's provided by internal audit in a changing world. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker for this segment. Dan Clayton is a member of the IIA International Committee of Research and Education Advisors. He is an organizational engineer designing systems of governance, risk management and internal control for his clients, and all of Dan's career has centered around expanding the capabilities of the internal audit. He previously served as a Director of Strategy and Knowledge Management for the University of Texas System Audit Office. Dan, you're very welcome on stage.
All right, well, I'm grateful to be here today and to receive an invitation to talk to you a little bit about a really interesting effort that I've been involved with. We heard a lot here over the last little while about the 3 lines of defense, and I've got to take that for granted. So I've been able to take that for granted, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means as we go forward. But I really want to focus on value. We've talked a lot about adding foresight, but what does that really mean? What does it mean to add additional value to our organization? And how do we approach it? What do we do first? So in the late 1800s, early 1800s, there was a lot of change happening in the United States of America, and a leader of the day, Ralph Waldo Emerson, really preached that genius is only found at the individual level. You have to strip away old creeds, old ideas, old thoughts, old masters, to really uncover the genius that is available at that individual insight level. And I think I agree with that. I think that's true. I think today we could all probably pick 3 or 4 people who truly have made an impact on the world and made it a better place just by who they are, and the presence that they've carried. However, we also live in a period of time where we're looking for bigger, better, more capability systems that span what we have done and what we could do and should do in the future. So how do you reconcile those two? We need more systems and fewer independent silos. So how do we really, bring those two ideas together and look at moving forward? And so we're going to address those two as we go through our presentation today. I think it's very critical as we think about what needs to be different tomorrow to really know where we're at today. We can't step forward until we know very specifically the value of the services and the products that we're delivering today. So with that, I wanted to begin today by introducing a book that I hope some of you or most of you have heard about. It came out in January of this year called Sawyers 7th edition. And Sawyers is a book that has been in the internal audit profession for a very long time. It dates all the way back to 1973 when Larry Sawyer, who was one of the original thought leaders in the industry, published it, his first large book. And it was seen as an encyclopedia of how to do internal audit. Now in its 7th version, the 7th version is very much a different book. It's largely brand new. And it's the product of what we, as members of the Committee of Research and Education Advisors for the IIA Global, really spent time trying to create. So about 2 years ago, in 2017, we were tasked with identifying what's next for this Sawyers series. And so in order, being the auditors that we were, we said, okay, let's take a look at what it should be. And so we went to the IIA and we asked them, what should it be? And they said, well, it's really important. It's a name brand that we don't want to lose. We want it to remain. We want it to be valuable. So what we did as auditors is we went back and we said, okay, what are all of the top publications that the IIA produces? We have CIA exam materials. We have we have the textbook, we have materials targeted at chief audit executives in Vision University and QIAL, and we pretty much, we're going to pause here for just a minute.
I think We discussed this last night, but news fresh in from the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and I've actually got a vote rundown from one of the Irish MEPs who just sent it to me. So the new European Commission has been approved by the MEPs, and the vote was 461 for, 157, I presume, I'm not sure 157, 89, but 461, and then the others were 157 and 89. So new European Commission has been approved, and presumably they start work on the 1st of December. There you go. Dan, thank you.
I feel like you're all applauding for me.
We are.
Oh, thank you. Well, a new era. This is a very poignant topic to be talking about, a new era. And so back to Sawyers. So our goal really, as we looked at the different sets of literature that are out there related to internal audit, was to look at what Sawyers should be. So we compared the agendas and the indexes of all this content, and then we said, what does the IA really want its members to understand? And it came down to two things. The IA wants its members to understand how to set up an internal audit function and make it effective, and wants them to understand how to deliver quality internal audit services and products. And so when we put that metric against all of the content that we found, we saw a gap, and that gap was largely in setting up an internal audit function to be effective, which is particularly relevant to the conversation today when we're talking about a dramatic amount of change, and we're talking about not just change within our industry, but the change that's all around us. So Sawyers' 7th edition's outline was born in late 2017, focused on very clearly defining how to set up an internal audit function today and how to deliver services and products. And so some of the content that we'll talk about briefly here is focused on how to bring value through our services and products. We'll talk about 44 value drivers. We're not going to get into the specifics, but we'll talk about what's in the book in terms of value drivers. We'll talk about 5 generations of services and products and why we set up the idea of illustrating generations that we've evolved through. We'll talk about what it takes to build people, process, and technology that need to be there within an internal audit function to do something different, to do something new. And then finally, we need to recognize, and it's interesting that very little of our literature out there recognized all of the things that are going on around us. GRC technology, second line of defense evolution, ERM evolution. So we needed to recognize that in the book as well. And then finally, what does all of this mean to the basics, risk assessment, audit planning, internal control? So I wanted to share, we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to share a couple of the chapters for this book with you. So the book is set up in the first 8 chapters to really look at the function itself. The first 5 chapters are focused on how do we set a direction for internal audit, how do we know where our products and services are, and how do we chart a course to something better. Then 3, 4, and 5 are really the people, process, and technology. How do we wrap operations around where we want to be and really take a big step forward. And then 6, 7, and 8 are all of those things that surround an effective function that make it relevant. And I'm really pleased to say that we had 10 contributing authors from 7 countries. Miss Janitha John was one of them. And really just adding a very international flavor to all of the leading ideas that came into putting this together and making it happen. So as we look in a little more detail on the first 2 chapters to give you a taste of what's in here, we had a gentleman out of Switzerland, Hans Burmer, who had written a book on internal audit strategy, and so we asked him to tackle this very first chapter on value. So how do we know what value is? And if you go out and you type in strategic planning on Google, you're going to find a lot of content, and you'll find a lot of different information out there and many different ideas and models. So he didn't want to replicate that. Rather, he wanted to focus on where value comes from. And value comes from the expectations. Well, whose expectations? Well, for us, as internal auditors, there are really 3 cornerstones of expectations. We have all of the stakeholders that we're trying to please and deliver product to. We have the role of the CAE itself within that organization. It may just be internal audit, but it may be broader than that. And then, of course, we have our standards of our profession and what we're trying to achieve and what standard we're being held to. So within each of these areas of expectations, Hans broke these down into 44 different drivers of value within those areas. So just a solid chapter on helping us to really think, what value are we delivering as we look at what we're doing today? In chapter 2, we borrowed here from Paul Sobel, who's the current COSO chairman. But back in 2002, Paul wrote a book entitled Integrating ERM and Internal Audit. And in his book, he presented the idea that as an industry, internal audit has evolved through generations. Each new generation offering a different marginal, value add, something new, some new value as we evolve through that generation. So we leveraged his concept and built it out throughout the book, and I'll talk about what other chapters are influenced by it. But essentially, Paul's comment was we've evolved from really the internal external auditor. We started in 1941 being the person, and the value that we brought to the organization was to make sure that when the financial or the public auditors came, they wouldn't find anything. That was the value that we brought early on. And then we got into process level. We said, well, we're gonna focus more on efficiency and effectiveness as well as that public reporting. And that came about in the 70s and 80s, and then by the 1990s, Paul commented on the idea of risk, that management pushed back and said, well, you're identifying these processes and they may or may not even be relevant to what my objective is for the organization. And so the idea that we as professionals would then illustrate to management why they should care through impact and likelihood and impact of a particular risk to the organization. And then Paul first proposed in his book in 2002 that it was important to really look at this from a top-down perspective. We needed to really think about not risk of anything that could go wrong, a disorganized perspective by internal audit, but risks that management is really managing and should be managing. So how do we look at what they should be managing and look at that from the top down? And then finally, as we started pulling in his concepts, we realized there's a lot of conversation out there today about being objective-based. How can we align what is at risk? We can't just say there's a risk. We need to tell the organization which strategic or business objective is actually at risk. So this idea of generations really carries through the material in this book. And the goal of this is to simply provide a framing to help you go through, look at it, and identify where you're at. This table, for example, in chapter 2, simply links each of these generations to a service and a product and a value proposition, as well as the typical skills. This is then carried through the book into other chapters. Chapters 3 and talk about operations. We actually leveraged the IIA Netherlands ambition model as one of the pieces of content that came into chapter 3. Chapters 4 and 5 go into people. How do we build the org chart? How do we, when we don't have enough resources to do this internally, who do we turn to? How do we leverage second line efforts? How do we leverage consultants effectively? And then the final part of that is, I got one more comment. The final part of that is how do we carry that into the back end of the book? And what does that really mean? And I think this is where we felt like we really came into some interesting realizations that the whole concept of risk and control, the definition actually changes based on the value that you're trying to deliver. If you're still back there trying to deliver value at the first generation level, then your risk and control definitions are very narrow. But if you're thinking of objective based, how do we enhance and protect organizational value, provide foresight, then your definition of risk and control becomes much bigger. And you also become much more capable of thinking systematically about how we interact best with the second line of defense or other organizations. So where do we want to go tomorrow? We've heard a lot already about where we want to be tomorrow, providing foresight. We've heard about the 3 lines of defense, which is a very effective way, and one that I just rely on today. It's been around so long. A very effective way of just defining the roles that we should be serving and the role that the other risk functions within our organization should be filling within the organization. But where do we want to go tomorrow? Particularly, that's a particularly important question when we think about these big systems. And these are systems. Enterprise risk management is intended to be across the organization. Integrated assurance or combined assurance across the organization. So I've seen many, many examples of attempts at implementing this that are driven by one function, and almost always the outcome is the same. That one function becomes the parent of that activity, and it never becomes a spine, if you will, that covers the whole organization. So we need to think bigger. We need to think about the system that needs to be in place, and sometimes that means we need to give something as internal auditors. It gets a little bit scary when we talk about giving something with regard to internal control. But in my last minute here, I wanted to share an example that I use in talking both with students and with management in trying to come to some kind of consensus on what does internal control actually mean. What does it mean to management? What does it mean to internal audit? And what does it mean to the second line of defense? And I think most of this is pretty comfortable space. When we think of technical controls or the things that our second line of defense functions really focus on making sure that we're mitigating a negative risk to the organization, those we're comfortable with. But when we get into operational controls, I've had some very fascinating conversations with managers about the way we view operational control. They say, well, you're down at the process level. What I really care about is how well the oversight is working. I really care about how well the capabilities of the people, process, and technology involved are evolving. Are they evolving fast enough to create the capacity that we're going to need? So thinking bigger about the controls in that space. And then finally, the ERM effort has really been pushing us into the world of thinking of strategic risk. How effective are the strategic decisions? Is there a process to make sure that bias is checked and that eliminated during these processes? So as we think of these bigger and broader systems and the need for foresight in the future, what is internal audit's role, and are we ready? Are we ready to play that role as we look forward? As we think about all of this, there is genius around us. I firmly believe that. I think each of us probably has some level of genius under the covers, and the better that we do at defining where we're at today and where we want to be, the more likely we are to be able to know how to apply that genius. So thank you for your time.